No one was ever supposed to know this. The receipt itself was a ghost, a brittle, brown slip of paper tucked inside the binding of a tax ledger from 1849. It was hidden for over 170 years, a secret kept by dust and institutional silence, until now. On the morning of April 11th, in the humid, mosquito-thick air of Augustine Parish, Louisiana, a transaction took place that was designed to be forgotten. A young man, barely 19, was sold on the courthouse steps. His crime was never officially recorded. The price was 17 cents. A widow, Maeve O'Connell, purchased him. She was a recent immigrant. Her husband lost to the fever a year prior, and she needed a hand to work her small, failing plot of land. She saw a boy, nothing more, a bargain born of some misfortune she couldn't fathom. She paid the 17 copper pennies, signed the deed with a shaky X, and led him away. She never knew his name wasn't Caelan, not really. She never knew the crime he was accused of was a lie, a carefully constructed piece of theater. And she never, ever knew who he had been secretly married to just 3 months before. How does a story like this vanish from history? What were we never meant to know? The truth wasn't just buried in an archive. It was erased from the world by a man who had the power to make reality itself bend to his will. He didn't just want the boy broken. He wanted him to cease to exist, to become a footnote on a receipt for 17 cents. A human life, valued at less than a handful of nails. The silence that followed wasn't accidental. It was engineered. The man who orchestrated this chilling piece of human theater was Judge Alistair Finch. In Augustine Parish, his word wasn't just law. It was scripture. He was a man carved from granite and swamp shadow, his family having controlled the parish's legal and financial arteries for 3 generations. His power was absolute, not because of the land he owned, though he owned thousands of acres, but because he controlled the very definition of truth. He presided over the court, he appointed the sheriff, he held the mortgages on half the businesses in town. To cross Judge Finch was not to risk your livelihood. It was to risk your existence. He could have a man's name stricken from the voting rolls, his credit evaporated, his property seized on a forgotten technicality. He was a king in all but name, and his kingdom was a place of suffocating order, where every person knew their place. The boy, Caelan, had been one of his acquisitions, not born on his plantation, but purchased years earlier from a trader passing through from Virginia. He was quiet, unusually intelligent, and possessed a stillness that unnerved the other slaves and fascinated the judge. Finch saw him not as a person, but as a beautiful, intricate chess piece. He had Caelan educated in secret, taught him to read, to understand ledgers, even to speak a little French. It was a whim, a pet project. The judge enjoyed owning something that no one else had, a mind he had personally cultivated, a soul he believed he had authored. But a mind once opened cannot be easily controlled. Caelan saw the world with a clarity the judge never anticipated, and that clarity would lead him to the one person in Augustine Parish he was never, ever supposed to see as an equal. A whispered historical rumor from that time, passed down through the Gullah communities of the coast, speaks of shadow marriages, unions between the enslaved and the powerful, consecrated not by law but by older, more binding vows. They were secrets that, if revealed, could unravel the very fabric of that society. This story is one of them. Caelan's duties eventually brought him inside the judge's immaculate white-pillared mansion. He was assigned to the library, a vast, silent room filled with books from London and Paris, and it was there he met her, Genevieve Finch, the judge's only daughter. She was 17, a ghost in her own home, educated but isolated, surrounded by wealth but suffocating from the rigid expectations of her father. She was promised to a senator's son from Baton Rouge, a political alliance that would further cement the Finch dynasty. Genevieve, however, had a mind as sharp as her father's and a heart he had long since forgotten how to nurture. She saw in Caelan not a servant, not a piece of property, but the only other person in her world who seemed to be truly alive. Their conversations began in whispers, hidden between the leather-bound spines of Voltaire and Shakespeare. He spoke of the stars. She spoke of the sea. He taught her the names of the constellations as he understood them from African folklore. She read him poetry from books her father forbade her to open. They were 2 prisoners in the same gilded cage, and in that shared confinement, something forbidden and beautiful began to grow. It was a love that was impossible, a love that was a death sentence, And they both knew it. But knowing and stopping were two different things. Their stolen moments became more frequent, more desperate. The silence of the library charged with a meaning that would soon tear their world apart. It was more than a romance. It was a rebellion of the soul. In the dead of winter, under the skeletal branches of a live oak that had stood for 300 years, they made a vow. They knew no priest would marry them, that no law would recognize their union. So they found an old woman on the edge of the swamp, a root doctor named Elspeth, who practiced traditions that predated the parish, that predated America itself. In a ceremony lit by a single candle, with vows spoken in a mixture of English and a language the judge would have called pagan nonsense, they bound themselves to each other. For a few stolen weeks, they were husband and wife in a kingdom of two, their secret a fragile shield against the world. But secrets in a place like Augustine Parish have a way of bleeding through. A misplaced book, a lingering look held a second too long, a note discovered by a house servant loyal to the judge. The details of how Finch found out are lost, but the explosion of his rage was legendary. It was not the hot screaming rage of a common man. It was a cold fury, a terrifying, silent pressure that seemed to suck the very air out of a room. He didn't confront them. He didn't rage or accuse. He simply began to move his pieces. The first move was to isolate Genevieve. She was confined to her rooms, her books taken away, the windows of her world shrinking until all she could see was her father's cold, unforgiving face. He never raised his voice. He simply explained in calm, measured tones that she had dishonored her name, her family, and her God. He told her she was sick, that her mind had been poisoned, and that he would cure her. It was a campaign of psychological warfare, designed to break her spirit completely. His second move was against Caelan. The judge understood that simply killing the boy would be too merciful. It would also create a martyr. No, death was an ending. The judge wanted an erasure. He needed to utterly annihilate the man his daughter had chosen, to reduce him to a state so low, so pitiful, that the very memory of him would become a source of shame for Genevieve. He devised a plan of exquisite cruelty. He took a silver locket, a gift he had given his daughter years ago, and planted it in Caelan's small sleeping quarters. Then he had the sheriff, a man whose career and life belonged to Finch, discover the stolen item. Theft was a common enough crime, but theft from the judge's own family was an unforgivable sin. Caelan was dragged from his bed in the middle of the night. He never saw Genevieve again. He was taken to the parish jail, a damp stone box where he was held for 2 weeks without a word. He wasn't whipped. He wasn't beaten. The judge's cruelty was more refined. He was simply left alone in the dark, with the silence and the rats, to contemplate the totality of his powerlessness. The charge was formally read, theft of property valued at $20. The punishment, by parish law, was to be sold at public auction. It was all perfectly legal. It was all a monstrous lie. The judge himself signed the order, his penmanship as elegant and merciless as the man himself. He was not just destroying a man. He was editing a story, rewriting a truth he found offensive, and ensuring that the final draft contained no mention of his daughter's love. The auction was set for April 11th. The morning was thick with a hazy, oppressive heat that promised a storm later in the day. A small crowd gathered on the courthouse lawn, mostly farmers and small-time merchants, men with weathered faces and calculating eyes. They were there for livestock, for a seized cotton gin, for the mundane business of a struggling parish. Caelan was the last lot of the day. He was brought out onto the steps, his hands bound in front of him. He was clean, a detail the judge had insisted upon. He was not to look like a common field hand. He was to look like what he was, a house slave, something refined, something that had fallen from a great height. The auctioneer, a man named Bartholomew, who owed Judge Finch a significant debt, began the proceedings. He didn't describe Caelan's skills, his literacy, his intelligence. He simply stated the charge and the judgment. Then he announced the opening bid. "The court sets the price," he bellowed, his voice straining, "at 17 cents. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. 17 cents? It was an insult. It was a joke. An enslaved man in his prime, even when accused of theft, was worth hundreds, perhaps $1,000. A price this low meant one of two things. Either the man was secretly diseased and dying, or this was something else entirely. It was a signal. The smarter men in the crowd understood immediately. This wasn't a sale. It was a ritual, a public shaming orchestrated by an unseen hand. To bid would be to interfere, to involve oneself in the affairs of the powerful. And in Augustin Parish, no one was foolish enough to do that. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. It was in that moment of suffocating silence that Maeve O'Connell, the widow, made her move. She didn't understand the politics. She didn't recognize the invisible lines of power shimmering in the air. All she saw was a boy who looked lost and a price she could actually afford. Her husband had left her with 3 acres of unplowed land and a debt at the general store. For 17 cents, she could have a helper. It was simple, desperate arithmetic. She pushed her way through the small crowd, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders despite the heat. "I'll take him," she said, her voice thin but clear. 17 cents. The auctioneer, Bartholomew, looked stunned. He glanced nervously towards the courthouse, where he knew Judge Finch was watching from his office window. This was not part of the plan. The plan was for Caelan to stand there, unsold, until the auction ended, a piece of human refuse no one would touch. He would then be remanded to the parish work farm, a place from which no one ever returned healthy. But a bid had been made. A legal, public bid. To refuse it would be to break the very laws the judge claimed to uphold. Bartholomew hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead. 17 cents from the widow, he called out, his voice cracking. He looked around, praying someone would counter, would do something to stop this unforeseen complication. But the crowd remained silent, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. They knew what this woman did not. She wasn't just buying a slave. She was picking up a cursed object, a piece of a story she was never meant to be a part of. "Going once," Bartholomew stammered, his eyes darting back to the courthouse window. "Going twice." He paused, giving the universe one last chance to correct this error. Nothing. The cicadas screamed in the trees, a sound like frayed nerves. "Sold," he finally choked out, slamming his gavel down with a sound that felt both final and deeply wrong. "To the widow O'Connell for 17 cents. Maeve counted out the coins, her hand trembling slightly as she dropped them into Bartholomew's sweaty palm. The deed of sale was drafted by a clerk whose hands moved with unnatural speed, as if he wanted the document out of his possession as quickly as possible. Maeve signed with her ex. The transaction was complete. She had just purchased a human being for the price of a spool of thread. As she led Caelan away from the courthouse steps, he didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on that second-story window, the one where he knew the judge was watching. Their gazes locked for a brief, searing moment across the square. In that look, 1,000 unspoken things were communicated. It was a look of triumph from the judge, a look that said, "See what I have made you." And from Caelan, it was a look of something else, not defeat, not hatred. It was a look of terrifying, unshakable promise. Maeve saw none of it. She was just a poor widow who had made a desperate bargain. She had no idea she was now the keeper of a king's ruined treasure, the accidental guardian of a secret that could still burn Augustin Parish to the ground. She was taking him home, to her small, dusty cabin, never knowing she had just bought a man who was married to the most powerful man's daughter. The cruelest lies are often told in silence. This quote, attributed to the philosopher Robert Louis Stevenson, perfectly captures the atmosphere of the O'Connell cabin in the days that followed. Maeve didn't know what to do with Caelan. He was not defiant, but he was absent. He worked from sunup to sundown, clearing the stubborn, clay-packed soil, his movements efficient and tireless. He did everything she asked of him, his obedience so absolute it was unsettling. But he never spoke unless spoken to, and his eyes held a haunted, distant quality, as if he were looking at a world only he could see. Maeve tried to talk to him. She asked about his life before, a question he answered with a simple, "I was in service, ma'am." She asked if he had a family. He just shook his head. The silence in the cabin was heavier than the humid air outside. It was a silence filled with his unspoken history and her unasked questions. She was a simple woman, devout and kind-hearted. The institution of slavery had always been an abstraction to her, a thing that happened on the grand plantations, far from her small life. Now, it was sitting at her rough-hewn table, a living, breathing enigma. She found herself watching him, trying to piece together the puzzle. His hands, though calloused now from the farm work, were not the hands of a field laborer. They were long and slender. The way he carried himself, even in his worn-out clothes, had a grace that seemed out of place. One evening she saw him staring up at the night sky, his lips moving silently. He wasn't praying. He was naming the stars. The judge, meanwhile, was consumed by a quiet, festering rage. The widow's interference had spoiled the perfect symmetry of his revenge. Caelan was supposed to disappear into the anonymity of the parish work farm, a place of slow, grinding oblivion. Instead, he was living just 2 miles away, a constant living reminder of his daughter's betrayal. Every day that Caelan existed was an affront to the judge's power. He became obsessed. He had the sheriff ride past the O'Connell place twice a day, a silent act of intimidation. He put pressure on the general store owner to deny Maeve credit, hoping to starve her out, to force her to sell the boy. But Maeve was resilient, and the small community of poor farmers, who held no love for the judge, began to help her in small ways. A sack of flour left on her porch, a few jars of preserves. They saw it as a quiet act of defiance against the man who held them all in his grip. The judge's frustration grew. He needed Caelan gone, but it had to be done in a way that didn't lead back to him. Another public spectacle was out of the question. It had to be quiet, final. He began to look for an instrument, a man who could operate in the shadows, someone who could erase a problem without leaving a trace. He found such a man in a Cajun tracker named Roque, a shadowy figure who lived deep in the swamps and was rumored to have skills that were not entirely natural. Roque was a man who found people who didn't want to be found, and who, for the right price, could make people disappear forever. The dynamic on the farm began to shift in subtle ways. Caelan, realizing the judge's gaze was still upon him, started to let slivers of his true self show. It was a calculated risk. He needed an ally, and this simple widow was the only one he had. One evening, he noticed her struggling with her late husband's account book. She could read numbers, but not words. Quietly, he stepped forward. "If I may, ma'am," he said, his voice soft. He took the ledger and in a few minutes had organized the chaotic entries, his handwriting a fluid, elegant script. Maeve stared at the page, then at him, her eyes wide with astonishment. "Where did you learn to do that?" she whispered. The judge valued certain skills, he answered, the first hint of irony she had ever heard from him. He began to help her in other ways, showing her how to better irrigate the fields, how to mend tools she thought were broken. He was not just a laborer. He was an architect of survival. A bond, fragile and unspoken, started to form between them. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It was the wary respect of two people clinging to the same piece of driftwood in a vast, hostile ocean. Maeve began to see him not as 17 cents worth of muscle, but as a man of profound and mysterious depth. And with that realization came a terrifying thought. Whatever he had done to incur the wrath of Judge Finch, it must have been something extraordinary. She was harboring not just a runaway, but a secret. And she started to understand that secrets in Augustine Parish had a very high price. A chilling visual description from an old parish diary. Saw the judge's man, Roque, in town today. He does not walk like other men. He glides silent as a water moccasin in his eyes. They are the color of swamp mud, and they see everything you try to hide. This was the man who now began to circle Maeve's small farm. Caelan felt his presence before he ever saw him. It was a change in the air, a stillness in the woods that felt unnatural. The birds would go quiet. The insects would cease their chirping. It was the predatory silence of a hunter closing in on his prey. Caelan knew what it meant. The judge had grown impatient. Time was running out. He had to act. He had one hidden card left to play, a secret he had guarded even from Genevieve. Before he was taken, he had managed to hide the only proof of his marriage, not a document, which could be burned, but something far more permanent. He had taken a small book of poetry Genevieve had given him, and on the inside back cover, using an ink he had made from berries and rust, he had written a short account of their vows, their secret ceremony, and he had signed it. Beside his name, he had pricked Genevieve's finger with a needle and pressed her bloody thumbprint to the page. It was a symbol, a piece of irrefutable truth. If that book were ever found, it would be a permanent stain on the Finch legacy, a story that could not be easily erased. The book was hidden in the one place the judge would never think to look, inside the old parish church, tucked behind a loose stone in the back of the fireplace. Caelan knew he couldn't retrieve the book himself. He was being watched. Every move he made was scrutinized. He needed to get a message to someone, but he trusted no one. The entire parish was a web of the judge's spies. So he devised a desperate plan, one that hinged on the courage of a woman who still knew nothing. He began to draw in the dirt, scratching out patterns with a stick while he worked in the fields. At first, Maeve thought it was just idle doodling, but then she noticed the patterns were intricate, almost like maps. One evening, as she brought him a cup of water, he didn't look at her. He just kept drawing, his finger tracing a line from a crude drawing of her cabin to a drawing of the church steeple. Then he drew a small square inside the church, and beside it, a shape that looked like a flame. He looked up at her, his eyes conveying a desperate, silent plea. It was a message without words, a map drawn in dust. He was trusting her to understand. Maeve felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach. She knew what he was asking. He wanted her to go to the church, to the fireplace. He wanted her to retrieve something for him. To do so would be to move from being a passive observer in this drama to an active conspirator. It was a choice. She could erase the map with her foot, pretend she hadn't understood, and live out her days in quiet servitude. Or she could trust this strange, silent man she had bought for 17 cents and step into the heart of the storm. For 2 days, Maeve was paralyzed by indecision. The fear of Judge Finch was a physical thing, a sickness in her gut. But the look in Caelan's eyes haunted her. It wasn't the look of a criminal. It was the look of a man trying to save his own soul. On the third night, she made her choice. After Caelan was asleep in the small barn that served as his quarters, she slipped out of her cabin, a small lantern clutched in her hand. The walk to the church was the longest 2 miles of her life. Every rustle in the trees sounded like the swamp tracker, Roch. Every shadow seemed to hold the judge's cruel, calculating gaze. The church was dark and silent. The back door was never locked. She crept inside, the air cool and smelling of old wood and candle wax. She found the fireplace, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her fingers, rough and calloused from farm work, searched the stones in the dim lantern light. She found it, a single stone that was slightly loose. With a broken piece of kindling, she pried it open. Inside the dark cavity, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound book. She pulled it out, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She didn't open it. She didn't want to know. She just knew it was the source of all this danger, the secret that was worth more than a man's life. She tucked it into her apron, replaced the stone, and fled back into the night, the book feeling like a block of ice against her skin. She had crossed a line. There was no going back now. When she returned to the farm just before dawn, she found Caelan waiting for her outside the cabin. He wasn't in the barn. He was standing there watching the road, as if he had been standing guard. He saw the book in her hands, and for the first time since she had met him, a flicker of something other than despair crossed his face. It was relief, so profound it was almost painful to watch. He took the book from her, his fingers brushing hers. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to thank me," she said, her own voice trembling. "You just have to tell me what we do now." Before he could answer, a sound cut through the pre-dawn stillness. A dog barking frantically from a neighboring farm. Then another. Caelan's head snapped up, his body instantly rigid. "He's here," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Roch." He pushed the book back into her hands. "There is a man," he said, speaking quickly, his words precise. "His name is Silas. He works the ferry at the Black Creek crossing. He is an old friend, one of the few the judge does not own. Give him this book. Tell him the mockingbird is free." Maeve stared at him, confused. "What about you?" "The judge doesn't just want the book," Caelan said, his eyes already looking past her, towards the dark tree line. "He wants me. I will lead Roch away from here. I will give you time. Go. Now." He turned and ran, not towards the road, but directly into the thick, tangled woods behind the cabin, a deliberate, sacrificial act. Maeve stood frozen for a second, clutching the book, his strange message echoing in her ears. Then she heard the sound of someone moving through the undergrowth, moving with an unnerving speed and silence. She turned and ran. Maeve ran like she had never run in her life, her breath tearing at her lungs, the dark woods pressing in on all sides. She didn't know the paths. She stumbled over roots, her face whipped by low-hanging branches. She just knew the direction of Black Creek, and she ran towards it, fueled by a terror she had never known. Behind her, she could hear the chase. Not the sounds of a clumsy pursuit, but the chillingly efficient sounds of a predator. A snapped twig here.